Hi guys, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today we are creating a vintage style card using the Ornate Ornament stamp set by Simon Says Stamp, as well as an embossing folder by Tim Holtz, which I will link below. It is I think it's discontinued, but there are a few places that you can still get it. So I will link it anywhere that I can find it below. So I'm going to be working on a piece of Nina Desert Storm cardstock, and this will be sort of my main panel. Now I am still waiting on my order of Christmas goodies, so I am working through my stash still. I'm hoping to have some newer products tomorrow in tomorrow's video, but my order got lost in the mail. So it ended up on the other side of the country, so I'm still waiting. So I'm going to stamp 2 of these ornaments, and I am going to be stamping with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3. This is a Copic Safe ink. It is a waterproof ink, but it also fades away. It does exactly what the title says, and it's great for any kind of no-line coloring. So I stamped out my first ornament there, and I'm just going to stamp it out onto a piece of Post-it note tape. I only really need that one side to be masked off just in case these overlap a little bit, and I'll place that down right over the image, line up my second ornament, and stamp that down as well. Now I did stamp this twice just so that you guys can see a little bit better on camera. You can see it fine in person stamping it just once, but it doesn't really matter how many times you stamp it. Those lines will kind of just disappear once you color over them. So I'm going to be using my colored pencils. I use the Polychromos, which I am by no means an expert at. I keep it very simple. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of this coloring. I'm starting off with the lightest color, and this is called Naples Yellow. And I'm going in with a very light hand just to kind of add a little bit of color to my one little section there. Then I'm going to work my way from the side of it towards the inside, because that center line there would be the one that would be most raised up, so that would naturally be the lightest. So I went in with the darkest color, which is Van Dyke Brown, then the raw umber, then the brown ochre, then the light yellow ochre, and then back to that lightest color, that Naples yellow towards the center. And I'm using pretty light pressure. I just want to get my colors to blend a little bit. It's not going to be perfect, and I'm seriously okay with that. I'm keeping it nice and simple. I want these to kind of look a little bit golden. So I continued coloring this whole ornament the same way. Each little one of these sections I colored the same way as I did the first. I did go over that center line with one of the mid-tone colors just to kind of bring that out a little bit. But that's pretty much it for that one. Now for this next one, I'm going to be using the same color combination, but the shadows on this one are going to be a little bit different. Now this is a round ornament, so naturally our highlight is going to be in the center, but there's 3 different sections that we can see. So I am starting with my lightest color. I'm not going to go over the whole thing just because I want to kind of map out my darkest areas. Then I'm going to go in with the darkest color. For either side, I'm kind of just outlining it so that I don't go beyond that line because I don't trust myself. But for either side, I'm going to bring that color in. So the darker color, I'm going to bring in just a little bit. For the middle section, being this would be naturally lighter, being it's a round object, I'm only pretty much outlining those lines. Then I can go on to my next color, which is the darkest mid-tone, and I'm going to extend these areas out a little bit on either side. You can see I'm just using some circular motions. Now for this center section, I am bringing this color out just a little bit, not nearly as much as I did on either side, but once again, using those circular motions. On to the next color, I'm just going to do the same thing. Again, on either side, I'm just going to bring that out a little bit further than I do in the center, using those circular motions with a very light pressure to get my colors to blend. Now, if you press too hard, you're not really going to be able to blend it too much. And that's just because once the paper has as much pigment as it's going to get on there, you're not going to be able to add any more, which means your colors aren't going to blend. So moving on to the lightest, or the second to lightest color here, you can see that I'm leaving a pretty large highlight in the center section, and that's because I want this to still appear round. So I'll finish off with this yellow, Naples yellow color, get these colors to blend a little bit. And now for the little hook, I just went in with my darkest color, making sure that my point is pretty sharp on my pencil, and I just pretty much went over it. You can use any color here. Now, obviously I needed these to be hanging on like a string or something. So I am going to use my T-square ruler, and I'm just going to line that up directly with that little hook. And again, taking that darkest pencil, and I'm pressing very hard here because I don't want this to go anywhere. Once my color's down, I want it to stay. So I did end up trimming this down just a little bit more. The ornaments were too small, I guess, for this large panel. So I trimmed it down another 1/4 of an inch. And I'm also taking another piece of the Nina Desert Storm, and I'm cutting that to be a 1/4 of an inch smaller than an A2 size card. Next, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending, and I'm using Distress inks. I'm going to start off with the Vintage Photo, which if you guys have been crafting for a while, you'll know that this was pretty much added to every card back in the day. When Tim Holtz first came out with his Distress inks, the first color I got was Vintage Photo, and every single card I made had distressed edges. So I'm just pretty much going around the edge of the card panel, and I'm going to also do this to the same panel that we just colored. Now, you can use Distress oxides for this. However, you do want to make sure that you're aware that the Distress oxides are a bit more opaque, where the Distress inks are transparent. So if you go over your image with Distress oxides, you're going to fade it away a little bit. So next I'm going to bring in some ground espresso, and I am just concentrating the very edges of the paper with this color. I'm not bringing it in towards the center, hardly at all. I am adding a little bit more to the corners, but pretty much I am starting off on my scrap piece of paper and just bringing my blending brush towards the paper just to get those edges really dark. And I am going to do that to both of the panels. Now, I did curl up one of those edges, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that that's happened to, but I'm going to be running this through an embossing folder, so it really doesn't matter if one of those edges is kind of curled up or bent, because it's going to flatten down or raise up in an embossing folder once I run that through. So I did go back to the Vintage Photo just to kind of smooth things out a little bit. It's a vintage look, so my ink blending does not have to be perfect. Then I can line this larger panel up in my embossing folder, just making sure those dots are somewhat straight, and then run that through my Gemini. So next we can kind of assemble everything, and obviously these panels are the same color and they're going to kind of blend in with one another. So I grabbed a piece of ivory cardstock as well as a piece of brown cardstock, and these are just both from my stash. I don't know the brand. I don't keep track of cardstocks. Very rarely will I ever even buy colored cardstock, but this is just colors that I've had in my stash. So I cut the cream colored panel just about 1/8 of an inch larger than each one of the panels, and the brown panel to be 1/4 of an inch larger than each one of the panels, and the larger brown there is actually a card base. We're actually using a brown card base for this card. Then I can just layer everything together, and this will kind of really make it pop from the page and actually stand out. I'm going to use some foam tape for the back of my main panel there with the ornaments, and I lined up the entire thing. Now, you can certainly use fun foam for this, but I had a feeling that some of my sentiment, if not all of my sentiment, was going to kind of hang off this panel, and I needed my layer of dimension to be the same, if that makes any sense. So if I were to use fun foam here and foam tape for my sentiment, I wouldn't have the same level of dimension. They might not be the same depth. So I'm going to line that up right there in the center of my embossed background. And for my sentiment, this is This is another one that I wasn't really too sure of. I should have used a smaller sentiment, but I didn't. I used this Christmas Blessings from the same stamp set, and I stamped this down onto another piece of the Nina Desert Storm. I'm using dark chocolate ink by Simon Says Stamp, just because you get a better impression with the dye ink than you do with the Distress ink. I used my mini tonic trimmer here to cut this down, and very little of the paper is actually showing. This is pretty much just a tad bit larger than the sentiment itself. I also took the cream color cardstock there, and it just happened to be the perfect size for my mat. So I'm going to add a little bit of the distressed edges to this as well, just so everything kind of matches perfectly. Did the same thing as I did with the larger panels, added a little bit of that vintage photo, and then going in with the ground espresso just on the very edges. I tried to pick this up like I used to do with the ink blending tool. That's the way we used to distress things before there were blending brushes, but it doesn't really work too well with a blending brush, at least not the ones that I have or the technique that I tried, but it all worked out in the end. So I'm going to adhere this down to this little cream colored cardstock piece here. And for the brown, I just didn't feel like measuring. So I'm just going to line this up in the corner by leaving just a little bit of the edges showing on the left and the bottom. Give that a second or two to dry, and then pop that into my trimmer. And I'm just kind of eyeballing it to make sure that just a little bit of that brown cardstock is showing, and I have somewhat of an even mat for both of those colored cardstocks. Kind of played around to see where I wanted this sentiment. The corner, originally it was going to be in the corner. That didn't look good. Bottom didn't look good. The top didn't really even look good, but that's where it ultimately ended up being. So it is going to hang off this main panel a little bit, which is where this another layer of dimension is coming through. So I'm just going to add some foam tape to the very top, because that's the only part that's going to actually be on the main card or the main background, and then some Tabomato multi-glue on the part that is going to be on the section that's already raised up anyway. So here's another issue, but even though this card is not exactly something I love, I did learn something, and hopefully you'll learn it too. So I'm using some Nuvo drops, and this is gold, and I always squirt this out on a scrap piece of paper and then bring that to my panel. Well, it was thick, and I didn't warm this up in my hands or anything first. I tried to tap it down, wasn't working, but I figured maybe I can use my heat gun to kind of heat it up and make this fall a little bit. It doesn't fall. What happens is that you can totally fix it. I'm going to slow this down and zoom in and see if you guys can see what happens when you add a little bit too much heat to your Nuvo drops. They burst, almost burst. It kind of makes this huge bubble. But what I found out is once this makes this huge bubble, they kind of harden up to kind of like a gummy texture. So I was able to take a palette knife. You can use a craft knife, you can use a pair of scissors, whatever you want, and I was able to scrape them off. Now, normally if this was just wet Nuvo drops, you'd be able to scrape it off, but you're probably going to smear it all over your card. And this kind of just picks up. It's a little bit gummy, and it does leave a little bit of residue behind, but I'm going to put more Nuvo drops right over top of it, so I'm not going to see that residue, but pretty much they come right up. So I ended up switching to some gold dream drops and added those right over the areas that I had added the originals. And hopefully, except for that one top corner there, hopefully nobody will really notice too much. But that is it. That is the card for today. Today's collaboration is with Tracy, different Tracy, not the same as the other day. And I will link her video below. She is also making a vintage style Christmas card for us. So go ahead and check her video out. And as always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.